What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the third installment of the Fair Catch Podcast. I'm Gabe Calderon. Tonight I got a really special fantasy football exclusive episode for everyone. I'm going to jump right in and we're going to discuss every upcoming game this week. We're going to highlight every running back, every wide receiver, every tight end, every quarterback for every single team. I'm going to talk about their matchups, talk about their projections. I mean, we all know as fantasy owners, it's that midway part of the season. Players are hurt. Nothing you can do. Your studs, they're on their bye weeks. So what? I've put together, guys, a full detailed episode to highlight everything that's going on in fantasy football this week in Week 9. So hopefully all your worries, concerns can be put to rest. Feel free to hop around the different games as I discuss them, or if you're just tuning in for specific games like concerning your current roster, or if you're just like me and love fantasy football, stick around with me for the whole episode. I got a lot to talk about and discuss, so we're going to get things started. Thursday Night Football. Oakland Raiders visiting San Francisco 49ers. 49ers, 3-point home favorites, 46.5-point over-under. I really expect this Thursday night game to honestly be quite a doozy. There's not really much fantasy star power in this one outside of the tight ends. But we're going to start in Oakland. Okay, we're going to talk about the Oakland running backs real quick. We got Doug Martin, Jalen Richard. Jalen Richard, 3 straight double-digit fantasy outings. He's used much more as a receiver like Tariq Cohen of Chicago, James White of New England. While Doug Martin, on the other hand, he's only been averaging just under 7 touches a game, which isn't going to give any fantasy owner any confidence. There's a lot of better options out there. And I'd lean towards Richard a little bit more, but I would urge owners to start him only if you're desperate, if you're really banged up with injuries or bye weeks, and there's no one else really out there that you have confidence in, then I would start Jalen Richard. Wide receivers for the Raiders, we really just got Seth Roberts, Brandon LaFell, and Jordy Nelson. And I'm just going to really talk about Brandon LaFell. He just signed, about a week and a half ago. I don't even think he got a full week's worth of practice in before he was out on the field last week for 90% of the snaps. I mean, I feel confident in this guy moving forward after Amari Cooper left for Dallas. And I think amongst all these receivers in this, disaster of an Oakland Raiders team, he's going to have more of an impact than any other of the receivers. And I like him moving forward. I don't think that he's necessarily a start this week. But, again, similar to Jalen Richard, if you're desperate, you don't really have any other wideouts. I mean, look, he was on the field for 90% of the snaps in his first week with just signing with the Raiders. He was targeted quite a few times. He only caught 3 passes, but, again, it was his first game. I would really look, towards him as a late midseason waiver wire pickup. And that's about it for the wide receivers for the Raiders. In terms of their tight end, Jared Cook, he's a top 5 tight end right now in fantasy. And it's only uphill from here, similar to Brandon LaFell with Amari Cooper leaving. This is going to open up Jared Cook to get a lot more targets. And the tight end position, you can't be picky with it this year. He's an auto start if you have Jared Cook. Derek Carr, interesting to talk about. And to be honest, he's a start for me this week. San Francisco's second worst defense against receiving touchdowns. They've given up 18 passing touchdowns so far this year and over 260 passing yards through the air. So if you have really no one better that has a more favorable matchup than Derek Carr, I give a start to Derek Carr this week. Now we're going to flip the field, talk about the 49ers, start with their running backs. We have Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert, and Alfred Morris. Okay, we'll start with Matt Breida. If he's healthy, we've all seen he's electric, he's powerful, strong runner, fast runner. If he's healthy, I like him as a low-end running back 2 flex option this week, but only in deeper leagues. He's getting consistent touches, over 11 a game, and is averaging low-end double-digit fantasy numbers this year. I'd stay 100% away from Raheem Mostert and Alfred Morris, even if Matt Breida isn't 100%. And if Breida isn't 100%, I would lean towards another running back in a different game. Now, for the wideouts, there's really not much to talk about outside of Marquise Goodwin. I mean, he's really a touchdown or bust kind of receiver. He's only averaging just about 2.5 catches a game. And in this matchup specifically this week, I like him as a low-end wide receiver 3 this week, considering Oakland's given up 16 touchdowns through the air, which is tied for 4th worst in the league. This is a game where touchdowns are going to have to be scored according to Vegas, and I expect San Francisco to find points somehow. And I think they're likely to get 1 or 2 through the air. So again, wide receiver 3 at best, and that's just, only in deeper leagues. George Kittle, Tight end for the 49ers. Another top 5 tight end in fantasy this year, similar to Jared Cook. Tight ends have been hard to come by. And Kittle has 6 double-digit fantasy outings already on the year, and he's targeted a lot. More than any other receiver on the Niners. He's averaging around 5 catches a game, and just like Jared Cook on the other side of the ball, I think George Kittle is staged for a big play matchup this week. He's got a big green light for me. And stay away from C.J. Beathard, quarterback of the Niners. Don't like him at all for the rest of the year. We're going to head out east, talk about Atlanta Falcons visiting the Redskins. Redskins, 2-point home favorites, 47.5-point over-under. I'm going to start with the visiting Falcons, talk about their running back situation. We have Tevin Coleman, we have Ito Smith. We'll start with Tevin Coleman. He's been getting consistent work in the absence of Devontae Freeman, and the potential is there from what I've seen. The carries are there for him. He's getting volume, but the yardage just really isn't. He's only gone over 100 yards once this year, and besides that, hasn't really come close to touching 100. I'm not really a fan of either Coleman or Ito Smith this week, as they're up against a Redskins defense who really prized themselves so far this year on stopping the run, ranking second best in the entire league. And they haven't allowed a big play run of over 20 yards, which is best in the league. So highest I'd rank Tevin Coleman is a running back 3 flex play for this week. But I'd advise, to really stay away from any Atlanta backs this week. And the only one I would, give considerable mention to is Tevin Coleman. Now you got the wide receivers. We have Julio Jones, we have Calvin Ridley, we have Mohamed Sanu, right? This receiving core can be really tricky to pick out who to start on a weekly basis. I think Julio Jones obviously is an auto start every week as a wide receiver 1. He's averaging 7.5 catches a game and 116 yards, which is one of the best in the league. I think Ridley, Sanu, oh man, they're so equal. It's really hard to get a gauge on which one is going to come out there and have more production in terms of fantasy points. I really like either one of these guys, again, Ridley or Sanu, as low-end wide receiver 3 plays, but really only play them if you're really pinched at the wideout position this week. Tight end spot for the Falcons, Austin Hooper. And, I really doubt in most leagues teams have more than one startable tight end. And that's just the truth. Hooper is averaging 7 catches per game over the last 3 weeks, and I love him in this matchup against the Redskins on the road. Matt Ryan, quarterback for the Falcons, he ranks 2 among all quarterbacks in fantasy this year. But, I'm iffy about this game, okay, because Atlanta, they score points, right? We all know they like to score points. They get their points mostly through the air. We saw this last week with Drew Brees. He only threw for about 120 yards and 1 touchdown. Redskins right now are 4th best in the league on defense against passing touchdowns, giving up only 11 all year. As much as I love Matt Ryan, and I think he's a startable quarterback all year, I have a gut feeling that you should look for another quarterback with a better matchup this week. If you really like Matt Ryan and think he's going to come out there, slinging the ball 300-plus yards, 3 touchdowns, give him the thumbs up. My honest opinion, I think you should find a quarterback with a better matchup for this week. Now we're going to talk about the running backs, okay? For the Washington Redskins, my man, Adrian Peterson. He's tied right now, 4th across all running backs with over 125 carries. And we've all seen what he's done in the last 3 weeks. He's been averaging 120 yards of turf. He's been getting 22 carries a game. This man's on pace for 1,300 rushing yards. This looks like vintage AP we're seeing out there. Sure, he's not as lateral and fast as he used to be, but he's still lower in the shoulder like he was back in 07, 08. Man, AP he's poised for a big year this year. And, the numbers don't lie. As much as people have been saying, oh, Adrian Peterson, he's old, he's banged up. Oh, you picked him in the 13th round. The numbers do not lie in fantasy football. You cannot deny the fact that Adrian Peterson right now statistically is a low-end running back 1, a high-end running back 2 for the rest of the year. And I'd confidently say he'll have another 20-carry outing at home against Atlanta this week. I love him in this matchup. I love him moving forward. Last week we saw him getting utilized in the passing game, nothing we've really ever seen before. It's exciting stuff. Big play for Adrian Peterson moving forward. Redskins' passing offense stinks. They rank in the bottom 7 in the league with only just over 200 yards passing a game. Stay away from all Redskins wideouts in this one. Tight end for the Skins, Jordan Reed, not really a fan of this week. But again, it's hard to be picky with tight ends this year. And honestly, if you really have no one else, then you can start Jordan Reed. As far as Alex Smith is concerned, there's about 20 other quarterbacks out there that are statistically better in fantasy football than Alex Smith. And really, unless teams in your league are hoarding quarterbacks, you should have no trouble finding someone to fill the void that Alex Smith will leave in this week's matchup. Now we're going to talk about a divisional game. We've got the Detroit Lions heading up north to Minnesota, visiting Lions 5-point underdogs on the road, 50.5-point over-under. We'll start with Detroit, talk about their backfield. Calderon Johnson, right? Rookie. He's looked electric when he's getting carries, running the ball. He's averaging about just over 6.5 yards per carry. And he scored double-digit fantasy points in every game except week 1, and that was against the Jets. And that was a game that Matt Stafford threw, I think, 4 or 5 picks. They were down like 20. It was a blowout from the gate. So there was really nothing for him, to see in that game. But besides that, he's averaging well over 10 carries and 66 yards a game. And he's been getting a lot, getting used more in the passing game, out of the backfield. Again, a lot like Tariq Cohen, James White, Melvin Gordon, backs like that. Last week the game script really didn't favor him. But the week before that, he torched Miami for 158 yards on 19 carries. He has that explosive potential. And with the absence of Golden Tate, who was just recently, earlier today, traded to the Philadelphia Eagles, I think this really frees up. I'm really curious to see if the Detroit Lions lean more towards the run or, more of a balanced offense or more towards the passing game this week. It's really up in the air. I really have no idea how Golden Tate's absence is going to impact that. So I like Calderon Johnson as a low-end running back 2 flex option this week and moving forward. I really don't think the game script will favor him that much on the ground, with Minnesota being a top 5 run defense. But again, he's being utilized in the screen game and he's catching passes. Last week he had a career high in receiving yards and receptions. The Lions are going to have to air it out, I think, to keep pace with the Vikings. And he'll be utilized in that passing game. And just stay away from LeGarrette Blount at any cost. Now we'll talk about the receivers of the Lions. In my opinion, this was one of the toughest receiving cores to gauge. But now that Golden Tate's gone, it's a lot easier. It frees us up. All we got is Marvin Jones and Kenny Galladay. Like I was saying before this, I think this game script's going to favor the Lions receivers, who will find themselves having to get open, catch passes, and put up points to compete with Minnesota on the road. I really love Marvin Jones Jr. coming off that 30-point fantasy outing. And Kenny Galladay, who's kind of slowed up, but the potential's still there. I think they're both steady, as it is right now, low-end wide receiver 2s, steady wide receiver 3s, who will see a decent amount of targets shared between the two from Stafford. As far as the tight end goes for the Detroit Lions, not a big fan of Michael Roberts this week. Stay away from him. Matt Stafford, I think he's staged for a nice 250 to 300-yard passing game and 2 to 3 touchdowns. Stafford's a go for me this week in Minnesota. Now we'll talk about the home Vikings. Start with their running backs, Latavius Murray, and the big fat question mark of the year, Dalvin Cook. Doesn't look like Dalvin Cook's going to be playing at all this week. I think they're going to wait for their bye week in week 10, and then hopefully, if he's healthy, bring him back week 11. So we'll stick with Murray. Latavius Murray, 3 straight 20-plus point fantasy outings and a touchdown in each of the last 3 weeks. He gets the goal line calls, and he'll continue to see a solid 15 to 20 carry workload with Dalvin Cook still sidelined. I love Murray as a running back too in this week's matchup and moving forward. And as far as the receivers go, not Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs. I try to come up with something clever to say, but there's really nothing clever you could say about 2 receivers on the same team ranking in the top 4 league-wide in targets and receptions. Both auto starts this week and auto starts moving forward. Stephon Diggs, high-end wide receiver 2. Thielen, top-tier wide receiver 1. Kyle Rudolph, on the other hand, tight end for the Vikings, has been somewhat steady all year for fantasy owners. And when I say steady, I mean that, he's getting 8 points a game, 9 points a game, 7 points a game. If you have him on your team, you probably don't have a better option at tight end. So I'll give the nod to Rudolph this week against the Lions. As far as quarterback goes for the Vikings, their shiny new $84 million toy, top 5 in fantasy amongst quarterbacks this year. Kirk Cousins, I think this week favors the downfield passing game for the Vikings. I love Cousins, despite the Lions ranking 7th overall in passing yard defense. But hey, they've coughed up 15 passing touchdowns, to receivers this year. So, I think that this is going to be a big game for Cousins. I can see a 25, 30-point fantasy outing. There's a lot of star power in this game. Got another divisional game. We have the visiting Pittsburgh Steelers against the 3-point home favorite Baltimore Ravens. 47-point over-under in that one. Start with Pittsburgh. Talk about the running back situation. Still no sign of Le'Veon Bell, and it seems that James Conner is set to see another big workload against the Ravens. The Ravens still rank as the best overall defense in terms of yardage, and they've allowed under 100 yards to opposing backfields they faced this year. Despite that, I'm still very, very, very confident that James Conner will remain a strong running back one candidate this week and moving forward so long as Le'Veon Bell is absent. And James Conner, he scored 2 touchdowns in each of the last 3 games. And he's rushed for well over 100 yards in all of them. He's catching passes out of the backfield, leaping over the goal line. I mean, this guy's doing it. Auto start every week moving forward. I think he's matchup proof. This was his first year. He did not expect to get the starting job, to start the season. I think he's adjusted well. And I just love this guy. I love watching him play. I think he's the exact kind of back that the Steelers want. And, again, if you have him, start him. As far as the receivers go, the Baltimore defense is second to only Jacksonville in defending against the passing game. And despite this being a 47-point over-under, I think this is going to be way under. But I still think that the Steelers receivers can make an impact. Juju Smith-Schuster, unfortunately, he only has 1 touchdown in the last 5 games, whereas his counterpart, Antonio Brown, has 8, and Ant Brown has scored in the last 5 games, finding the end zone more than any other Pittsburgh receiver by far. As far as Juju is concerned, I put him as a low-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in this matchup specifically. But I love Antonio Brown, strong wide receiver 1 candidate. He'll remain Big Ben's favorite target down the field. Expect him to grab a touchdown, 100 yards receiving in this game. Points are going to come from somewhere. Tight end for the Steelers, Vance McDonald. We all love watching his stiff arm highlights, trucking over linebackers. But he's really a coin flip for me in this one. If you're really pinched at the tight end position and there's really no one on waiver wires, or if you can't make, a trade, package some players together to try to get a big name tight end, I think he's your only option. And you got to give him the start this week. Now we'll talk about Baltimore. Big Ben. Can't mention Pittsburgh without Big Ben. I think he's poised for a decent game against Baltimore. I think he's consistent enough in these divisional games that he'll, post a 15, 20-point fantasy outing. I'd probably lean towards another quarterback with a more favorable matchup. So I would definitely, lean towards not starting Big Ben in this week's game. Now we'll talk about the Ravens. We'll talk about the really only running back who I think is startable right now in their backfield, and that's Alex Collins. And this guy's an interesting running back to talk about because the carries and the work, they're there every week, right? But the yardage really isn't. I mean, he hasn't run for over 70 yards all year, and he's just really a touchdown or bust kind of running back for fantasy purposes. And, the fumbles are the biggest problem for me with Alex Collins. I mean, he has 3 on the year and 2 on the goal line. But he'll get the goal line calls. He's been getting the goal line calls. And for that reason only, I put him in between a low-end running back 2, running back 3 flex option this week. I think the game script's going to favor running backs for each team. So consider Alex Collins this week. As far as the receivers, this is definitely a gamble. John Brown, Willie Snead, Michael Crabtree. I want to highlight John Brown, who I think is the only startable wideout for the Ravens this week and moving forward. He's a deep threat. He's a speedster, and he ranks number 1 league-wide amongst wideouts, minimum 30 receptions, and yards per catch with 19 yards a catch. I mean, that's the definition of a boomer bust type of receiver. If you like to gamble and when it pays off, you're feeling happy, I like him as a low-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 for this week's matchup. If you don't, I tend to stay away from the Baltimore receivers for the most part this week. Tight ends for the Ravens will remain to be a non-factor as they have been so far this year. And Joe Flacco really hasn't been the fantasy stud that I don't know if people expected him to be, but he just really hasn't put up anything worthy of taking note to or being like, maybe I can start him in this matchup. So that's it for the Ravens. Now we head out to the dog pound. The visiting Chiefs opening up at 8-point favorites on the road, 51.5-point over-under. We'll start with the Chiefs, talk about the main back, Kareem Hunt. Not a lot needs to be said about him. I mean, top 5 running back all year. He's been absolutely stellar, and seeing him getting more work in the passing game has gotten fantasy owners even more excited moving forward. To those of them that stayed, loyal and didn't give up on him for the first, few weeks where he had very poor fantasy outings. I like Hunt as a strong running back 1 candidate for the rest of the year. I like him in this matchup. He's proven himself to be matchup proof after week 2. So big nod, big green light, Kareem Hunt. Now we got the Chiefs wide receivers. This is going to be interesting this week because the only 2, real ones worth a mention is Tyreek Hill and Sammy Watkins, right? Tyreek Hill owners, I urge you guys pay close attention to the groin injury that he suffered, as that will be monitored throughout the week. I have been checking all today, all yesterday as a Tyreek Hill owner myself. I'm a little nervous. I'm trying to figure out something in case he doesn't play. So for all owners out there, really, monitor the status of Tyreek Hill. Check how he did in practice tomorrow and Wednesday, Thursday. See how well he's running with the pads on in practice, because this is the kind of guy you need to pay attention to. I mean, he's ranked number 2 in fantasy among wide receivers. Obviously, if he's healthy, he's an auto start, he'll remain a top wide receiver 1 candidate. And in terms of Sammy Watkins, this gets more interesting with this Tyreek Hill injury, because regardless of the injury to Tyreek Hill, I like Watkins. I like him as a wide receiver 3 flex play this week, and he's really a boomer bust type of guy. I mean, I don't think he ranks above 45 right now at the wideout position in terms of fantasy points. But last week he got a little bump up in that, in that department with the big game. However, if, Hill is inactive on Sunday, I think Watkins' priority gets bumped way up to a high-end wide receiver 2 play because Mahomes is going to have to throw touchdowns to someone. This is a 51.5-point over-under. Chiefs are 8-point favorites. So these points are going to come somewhere. I don't see Harrison Butker kicking like 6-7 field goals. I like Watkins and Tyreek Hill a lot in this game. In terms of Travis Kelce, their tight end, he's the number 2 tight end in fantasy. It's an obvious start if you have him. This Chiefs offense is insane. They have a player right now at every position on offense that ranks in the top 5 of fantasy scoring at their respective positions. That's crazy. And then you got Patty Showtime. Mahomes remains matchup proof from here on out, and advise everyone who has him to start him every week regardless of the matchup. And we'll flip the field, talk about the crumbling Cleveland Browns that are in the midst of a disaster after firing head coach Hugh Jackson, offensive coordinator Todd Haley, Carlos Hyde, their main backs now in Jacksonville. Nick Chubb, we'll start with the running back in Cleveland. We'll talk about Nick Chubb. The priority on him got bumped way up across all leagues 3 weeks ago. After Carlos Hyde got traded, he practically owns the backfield right now for the Browns. Not really, too concerned with Duke Johnson getting anywhere more than 3-4 carries a game. And Nick Chubb has gotten 18 carries in each of the last 2 starts since Hyde's been gone, and he'll remain getting consistent work on the ground. He'll remain getting, goal line carries. I love him as a low-end running back 2 flex play for the rest of the year. For the receivers, it's been kind of disappointing for us Jarvis Landry owners. Jarvis Landry, Antonio Callaway, the 2 main receivers for the Browns right now. I'm really hoping the firing of Hugh Jackson and Todd Haley can reignite this just atrocious Browns team that, to be honest, they started off the year looking promising. With that come-from-behind win Thursday night earlier in the year against the Jets where they benched Tyrod Taylor and they brought in Baker Mayfield, and it was like, oh, my God, we've got, the next great thing, which, not to jinx anything, we all know over the last 10, 15 years what Cleveland Brown quarterbacks have done. But despite that, I think Jarvis Landry remains a strong wide receiver 2 play. In all standard league PPR, he gets the catches. I understand he's come out and said it's been a little bit of a tough adjustment, transitioning from Tyrod Taylor, who he had all offseason, practicing, getting, the first team reps with. So I still think that chemistry is yet to develop fully for Jarvis Landry and Baker Mayfield, but he remains a strong wide receiver 2 play. He's going to get the catches. He's going to get the targets every week. In PPR leagues, that's fine, and it's only an added bonus when he comes away with a 100-yard receiving day and maybe a touchdown. Antonio Callaway, on the other hand, I'd advise at all costs to stay away from. And the tight end, David Njoku, last week, fantasy owners were hoping for a big day when he put up a big fat 0 on the scoreline. I mean, it was very disappointing. And it wasn't like he was injured or didn't play. I mean, he had his pads on. He was on the field running routes. I think we can brush that off, that poor performance. And for me, he still remains a strong tight end candidate moving forward, considering the state of tight ends in fantasy this year. Baker Mayfield, he's young and talented, but I'd stay away from him, especially with a new play caller coming into Cleveland. Now we're going to head down south, talk about some AFC East action. We got the Jets visiting the Dolphins. Dolphins are 3-point home favorites, 45-point over-under. And we're going to talk about the Jets. Okay, full disclaimer, right now, there's only one player that's worth even a mention on this terrible Jets team, and that is Isaiah Crowell. Okay, I mean, Crowell looks like he's going to have another undisturbed Sunday in the backfield as the primary back. Okay, Bilal Powell's on injured reserve. He didn't have any competition last week. But I just really haven't been too sold on Crowell this season. Solely because of his inconsistency. We all remember that Week 5 performance against Denver where he torched them for 219 yards on the ground. Besides that game, Crowell's been averaging 13 carries for a measly 37 yards a game. And he hasn't had any game this year with more than 2 catches, which really just makes him a boomer bust touchdown reliant running back in PPR formatted leagues. The reason I mention Isaiah Crowell, though, is because they're playing against the Dolphins, who right now, as it stands, ranks 4th worst in the league against opposing running backs, giving up 30 fantasy points on average to opposing backs to go along with 10 touchdowns. I really just like Crowell this week as a low-end running back 2 flex play solely because of that terrible Miami run defense. They just love to sit in this nickel, come out with these young DBs, people can't tackle. So give him the start, low-end running back 2 flex play, but for this matchup only. Jets receivers been far too inconsistent this year to warrant any serious thought. Don't even consider giving any of them a start this week. As far as their tight end go, Chris Herndon, nothing there. Sam Darnold, the quarterback, again, nothing there. It's going to be a disappointing fantasy day for probably all the Jets players unless Crowell comes away with something big. On the other side of the sideline, we have the Dolphins. Okay, now we have an interesting backfield dilemma going on in Miami. Okay, we'll start with Frank Gore. Old man Frank has been getting double-digit carries in each of the last 5 weeks. With only one 100-yard rushing day and only 1 touchdown that came from a reception back in Week 4, he's been getting the work a little bit more than Kenyon Drake on paper. But in terms of fantasy production, Kenyon Drake's your guy out of this backfield. Okay, he's been averaging significantly less carries than Gore, but is utilized a lot more in the passing game, making him much more viable for PPR leagues, and he scored 4 touchdowns over the last 5 games. I think 2 or 3 of those being through the air. I give a confident nod to Kenyon Drake this week out of the Miami backfield in this matchup, and I like him as a low-end running back 2 flex play for this week's matchup. As far as the Miami receivers go, not too confident in Brock Osweiler's capability to air the ball downfield, so we have Devontae Parker and Danny Amendola. So as far as these 2 receivers go, I think if you're really in a pinch, I really don't think that anyone should be in a position where they have to start either one of 2 of these guys, but for argument's sake, I think Amendola has the upper hand in terms of targets that he's going to get from Brock Osweiler. And moving forward for the Dolphins, he scored at least 14 points, fantasy points, in each of the last 3 games. Okay, granted, last week it was maybe a little bit inflated on the stat sheet with that, trickery 30-yard pass to Kenyon Drake downfield. But again, I really don't like any of these Miami receivers. I really wouldn't consider starting any of them. I really only like Amendola as maybe a low-end wide receiver 3 play, again, if you're just banged up with injuries or bye weeks, because the Jets, they've given up a league-high 212 targets to opposing wideouts they face, which, in comparison to the Detroit Lions, who are the lowest, they've only given up 99 targets to opposing receivers. So that just goes to show that I think Amendola could quite possibly have a 7 to 10 catch kind of day, and it wouldn't surprise me. But will he get a touchdown? I don't know. Will it be a 100-yard day? I don't know. The Jets have, they've averaged giving up 43 points to opposing wideouts, which really got me thinking, should I consider starting, Devontae Parker, Kenny Stills, Danny Amendola? But I think this is going to be more of a game that's going to lean towards Frank Gore and Kenyon Drake. Again, Devontae Parker, I believe his stats got inflated too last week. Caught a circus of a catch that bounced off a receiver and then bounced off a defender's helmet, and then he caught it for like a 60-yard play or something like that. So, it's important to really understand where these points are coming from and that there might not be consistent moving forward. Again, the Jets, they've given up all these targets to receivers, but I'm just not really sold on Brock Osweiler's capability to air it downfield. Well, I can't say Osweiler. That's a hard name to say. But anyway, that's all I got for the Dolphins in that game. And in terms of Brock, I'd stay away from him at quarterback in this game. Now we're going to head up to Orchard Park. Buffalo playing host to the Bears. Bears coming into this game at 8.5-point favorites. And this is a very low 37-point over-under, which is going to be interesting to talk about. So we're going to start with Chicago, talk about the running back situation there. There's got a lot of fantasy owners scratching their head. Okay, Tariq Cohen and Jordan Howard, the two backs for Chicago. Jordan Howard owners are feeling it, almost as bad as David Johnson owners this year. I mean, every week you play Jordan Howard, you pray he's going to get a boatload of touches and score a touchdown or two. And, he scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks, and he almost had a third that got called back for holding. I mean, he is yet to get a 100-yard rushing day or anything close to a 100-yard rushing day. And to make matters worse, he hasn't scored more than 16 fantasy points all year, and he's literally non-existent in the passing game, and that's where Tariq Cohen comes into play. I really think it's time for Jordan Howard owners, to hear the truth, and the truth is that Howard has been a touchdown or bust running back, much like Alex Collins, and Tariq Cohen is just a better running back in Chicago. For the rest of the year, I'm downgrading Jordan Howard, not just this week, but every week, to a low-end running back 3 flex play. I don't have too much confidence. I think there's too much talent in running back and backfield spread across the league to depend on a touchdown or bust kind of running back. I give the green light to Tariq Cohen as a solid running back to play this week and moving forward. I mean, he scored a touchdown in each of the last 4 games, and he's averaging a staggering 6 catches for 87 yards receiving out of the backfield and 23 fantasy points over that span. I expect another big week for Tariq Cohen. Green light for me this week. Now, the Bears receivers have been a little bit tricky to gauge, okay? Sure, the Bears have been putting up a lot of points on offense. So we have Taylor Gabriel and Allen Robinson, okay? No receiver for the Bears has come anywhere close to being a top 30 receiver in fantasy, which is a little bit concerning. And heading into this matchup against, in Orchard Park against the Bills team who ranks 6th best in the league in passing defense, to be completely honest with this, low 37-point over-under, I don't like any of these Bears receivers past the low-end wide receiver 3 play for this week's matchup. Bears are 8.5-point favorites on the road with a 37-point over-under, and that can tell fantasy owners something. That'll tell us that the Bears are going to hold the lead for most of the game, and they're going to control the pace of the game. This could be a favorable script for Jordan Howard, in all honesty. This could be a game where Jordan Howard gets 20 to 25 carries solely to keep, the Buffalo Bills offense off the field and the Chicago defense rested. But again, I don't think it's going to be a big fantasy production day for Jordan Howard. I think that's going to go the way of Tariq Cohen. So stay away from, all Bears receivers for this week. And as far as Trey Burton goes, their tight end, this is a little bit interesting. He's emerged as a decent option in recent weeks for fantasy. And we've seen his, percentage owned in leagues skyrocket over the past 3 weeks. He's averaging 14.6 fantasy points over that span. And, Leslie Frazier and the Bills, they love to run the zone defense more than any other team in the NFL. And this could lead to more productive day, for Trey Burton. With Allen Robinson and Taylor Gabriel on the outside, big physical receivers, this is going to free up Burton to find open pockets and exploit this Bills coverage. I honestly like Trey Burton a lot in this matchup. I think he's going to have a 5 to 6 catch kind of day. And if you got him, I think you start him. Now, Mitch Trubisky, Chicago quarterback, he's been low-key productive for fantasy this year. I mean, he ranks 7th right now amongst all quarterbacks. But, seeing how unproductive Brady was last night against the Bills, and the fact that Brady, to no one's surprise, has way more talented weapons to throw to, I don't think Trubisky will do much better. I mean, that is a tough environment to play in, especially for a young quarterback. This is, like I was saying again, with this over-under, the point spread, this is going to be a game where this isn't going to be an air-the-ball downfield type of game. This is going to be more Jordan Howard chewing up the clock and Tariq Cohen getting in space. I'd stay away from Trubisky this week and look for another quarterback with a more favorable matchup. Now we're going to go talk about the Bills. Okay, running backs, LaShawn, Shady McCoy, Chris Ivory. With the backs of the Bills, it's leaning more towards Shady McCoy between these two backs. He's getting a little bit more work, right? But the fantasy numbers might be a little surprising to most people in terms of the fantasy numbers of Chris Ivory and LaShawn McCoy. They're practically identical this year, which is very concerning considering McCoy is owned in more than 74% of leagues than Chris Ivory is, but has scored only 8 more fantasy points all year. I think McCoy owners are under this very big spell similar to Jordan Howard, that each week Shady's going to come out there and be the Shady McCoy that he was in Philadelphia. And while, yeah, sure, that might be true, it's just so highly unrealistic to gamble a starting spot at the running back position on your roster. I think you confidently sit both running backs for the Bills against the Bears defense, who's third best against the run. And listen to this, they're the only team, the Bears are the only team on defense league-wide who hasn't allowed a rushing touchdown through 8 weeks. Not only do I not like Shady and Chris Ivory moving forward, I mean, I don't even think they get more than 5 fantasy points this week. And, I think it's safe to say, Derek Anderson just doesn't have the capability to do anything significant in the passing game. And for that, I think you sit all Buffalo Bills players in this game. Now we're going to head out to Carolina, divisional game. Panthers, a touchdown home favorite, 54.5 point over-under against the visiting Buccaneers. Now we're going to start with Tampa Bay. Big news, benching Jameis Winston. He's benched. He played terrible last week. I mean, he looked like a spaz out there. I don't know what was going on. Fitzmagic almost did something magical that week. I mean, last second field goal by Cincinnati. The Bengals defense had a meltdown once Fitzpatrick came in the game. And I think that might be a big, play a part into that. They were more prepared for Jameis Winston. But still, I mean, listen, I think Fitzpatrick is going to impact the Tampa Bay receivers this weekend moving forward if he remains the starter. We're going to start with the running backs for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the really only consideration for a start this week out of that backfield would be Peyton Barber, averaging 12 fantasy points over the last 3 weeks. However, he's practically a non-factor in the passing game, which is going to be more of a thing with Ryan Fitzpatrick. And if they are running it, it's going to be Fitzpatrick scrambling for like 15 yards. I really don't think there's a world in which you start Peyton Barber this week against the Panthers defense, who's top 10 in fantasy against opposing running backs, and they've only given up 3 touchdowns on the ground all year. So nothing really to see out of the Tampa Bay backfield. Now, things really get interesting when we talk about the receivers. We got 4 receivers that we can talk about for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We obviously have the wide receiver 1, Mike Evans. Then you got Deshaun Jackson, Adam Humphries, and Chris Goodwin. Okay, I think it's important to highlight the snap count percentages for each of these 4 Tampa receivers. As it should be with 4 receivers on one team, similar to New England, it can be concerning as to who's going to get more volume. Okay, and it really comes to no one's surprise that Mike Evans leads all the receivers on the team. He's on the field for 83% of offensive snaps. But it's really quite alarming to see Deshaun Jackson at the bottom of this receiving core, having only been on the field for 50% of plays ran on offense, which is the lowest by far among the 4 wideouts for the Bucs. With the emergence of Adam Humphries and Chris Goodwin so far this year, I think Deshaun Jackson's, priority plummets. And I wouldn't even consider starting him this week or moving forward. All he is a deep threat. If he's open, he gets a touchdown. Highly unlikely, too much of a gamble. I put Humphries and Goodwin as playable low-end wide receiver threes, but only if you're really in a pinch. And leading the pack without doubt, Mike Evans, who I think is staged for, another breakout game, coming off a 29-point outing last week, against the Panthers this week. I love him as a strong wide receiver one option this week and moving forward. Now, the tight ends, O.J. Howard, he's thrived more so with Jameis Winston, as Jameis likes to go to him a little bit more than Fitzpatrick. I think he's still a good play, though, in this matchup. He's been having double-digit fantasy outings in each of the last 5 games, and I confidently think that he'll have somewhat of a productive outing in Carolina. Talking about Carolina, let's talk about their running back, Christian McCaffrey. The primary workhorse out of that backfield. There's no question that he's an auto start this week and every week as a confident low-end running back 1, running back 2, depending on your roster. And, despite not rushing for over 60 yards in any of the last 4 games, he's going up against the Tampa run defense that just got torched last week by Joe Mixon, who ran all over them for 123 yards and 2 scores. I expect a big 25-plus point fantasy outing for McCaffrey this week with a solid workload on the ground and through the air as well. He's a tremendous receiver. He's got great hands. He can run a route as well as any receiver. I love McCaffrey in this matchup. Now the receivers, and honestly, there's really not much to highlight here. We have Devin Funchess, DJ Moore, and Curtis Samuel. And hey, listen, guys, the Buccaneers, they hold the crown for something, and that's worst passing defense in the NFL. They're giving up a staggering 318 of yards through the air and a league-high 20 receiving touchdowns. And, although none of the Panthers receivers have really been studs this year, I give a confident nod to Devin Funchess in this matchup as a low-end wide receiver 3. And again, this is only if you're in a hole at the receiving spot with bye weeks or injuries. I think Devin Funchess, you can feel somewhat confident he'll come away with a double-digit fantasy outing. Tight end for the Panthers, old man Greg. Greg Olsen has come alive in the past 2 weeks. He's catching a TD in each of the game. Not a lot of receptions or yards, but, at this point in the year, all you really need your tight end to do is go out there and catch a touchdown, and you can sleep well. If Greg Olsen is your only tight end, I say start him unless you have someone else like a Jared Cook, Travis Kelce, George Kittle. So if that's all you got, start him. And quarterback for the Panthers, Super Cam, he enters this week as the number 4 fantasy quarterback, and he's thrown for at least 2 touchdowns in every game except opening week. We all know what he's capable of doing as a ball carrier on the ground, and it's no question that Cam Newton, he's staged for a huge breakout game. Big green light as a starter in this matchup. Now we move out west. We got the Chargers. I almost said the San Diego Chargers. I keep forgetting they're the LA Chargers and then there's the LA Rams. It's so confusing. Anyway, the Chargers going up against the Seattle Seahawks in Seattle. 2.5-point underdogs for the Chargers. 48-point over-under. Interesting game to talk about. The Chargers, it's going to be interesting, to monitor this hamstring injury that Melvin Gordon has. There's still no confident thumbs up from the coaching staff that he's going to be 100% healthy this week. So, I urge fantasy owners to pay close attention to his status rolling into Sunday. We've all seen what hamstring injuries have done to top running backs such as Leonard Fournette and Dalvin Cook. Practically leaving them sidelined for the whole year. If he does return Sunday, though, I still think he's a must-start high-end running back 2, low-end running back 1, considering what he's done on the ground and through the air this year. Even if, Melvin isn't 100% healthy, or he's on a limited snap count, then maybe you have some consideration to maybe not play him. And that's only if they come out and say, hey, listen, Melvin, he's only going to get 10 carries a game, this game, or something like that. So on the flip side, Austin Eckler, he gets used a fair bit, even with Gordon manning the backfield for a majority of games, And even if Gordon, is healthy, I still like Eckler as a potential flex play. And if Gordon isn't healthy and Eckler is going to be getting the start, I think you can bump Eckler up a little bit. This is going to be a ground and pound kind of game. It's going to be quite a few touchdowns to be scored. I like Eckler as a low-end running back 3 flex play this week if Melvin Gordon is injured. Again, Melvin Gordon owners pay close attention, monitor his status moving into Sunday. Wide receivers for the Chargers, we have Keenan Allen, Tyrell Williams, Mike Williams. So no question, Keenan Allen has been a steady wide receiver 2 moving forward for the rest of the year as targets and receptions are concerned. And I expect his production to pick up, especially in the touchdown department, much like Julio Jones. I mean, Keenan Allen, he's only had 1 touchdown all year, coming back in week 1 against the Chiefs. Opposite Allen, we have Tyrell Williams, and he's coming off a back-to-back, 100-yard receiving outings with touchdowns as well. And, he's much like John Brown. He's a deep threat. He presents the same type of skill set that John Brown does. He's a hit-or-miss deep threat. And I really wouldn't rank him for that, for that factor alone more than a low-end wide receiver 3 that you should only play if you're struggling at the wideout position. So Keenan Allen gets a thumbs up for me as a wide receiver 2 this week. At quarterback, we got Phillip Rivers, and he's had an average fantasy season thus far. He's averaging a steady 21 points per outing, which is more than you can ask for from your quarterback. And I think you need to sit him this week. I really think you need to sit him. Seahawks rank number 1 in the league against opposing quarterbacks, giving up on average 13 fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think the Seahawks will continue running the ball as they have been recently and will really limit the amount of possessions the Chargers get, which will in turn limit Phillip Rivers' fantasy production. Now we talk about Seattle. That was a fun one to talk about. We're going to talk about that running back by committee situation going on with Pete Carroll's team. We have Chris Carson, Mike David, Rashad Penny. I'm just going to throw Rashad Penny out of the window real quick as he didn't even get on the field last week. So it's really between Chris Carson and Mike Davis. So it's week 9's here. We finally have a clear picture of this Seattle backfield. And, before we talk about Chris Carson and Davis, I want to point out, which I think is very important for fantasy owners to realize, that Seattle calls more run plays than passing plays than any other team in the NFL up to this point right now. And Pete Carroll, he's come right out and said it. He said, hey, we want to stick with old school, buckle your chin strap football and run the ball down your throat 30-plus times a game. I give the nod to Chris Carson over Davis moving forward. I think a lot of people are really overlooking Chris Carson's value as a running back in fantasy football so far, as he'll remain the starter moving forward, like Pete Carroll said, on a team that, runs the ball more than they throw it. I mean, why don't you want a guy like that on your team who's projected 16 to 20 carries every week? He's fresh off a 25-carry, 105-yard day on the ground and a touchdown. I like the same type of production from Carson this week and in future weeks, and I place him as a low-end running back too if things remain the way they've been going. Now the receivers, very, very disappointing for the Seahawks, considering Russell Wilson has not been having, a season that hasn't matched his career numbers. And, Doug Baldwin is the name that sticks out to me when we're talking about this receiving core. Sure, he hasn't been 100% and his production has been subpar, to say the least. I really urge fantasy owners to pump the brakes on Doug Baldwin. Try to package something together if you're desperate, and in need of a receiver. It's really not worth the gamble. Like we saw 1 catch for 1 yard against the Rams a couple weeks back. Couple that with the fact that I just mentioned Seattle is a hard-nosed running team. I think you lay off all Seattle receivers this week. Owners might see David Moore and Tyler Lockett's stat sheet and think, oh, they're getting these touchdowns every game the past 4 weeks. And while that's true, I mean, neither of them has caught over 5 passes in a game all year. It's really not worth the gamble in PPR leagues as there's so many better names out there at the wideout position. And quarterback, Russell Wilson, he started off the year disappointing fantasy owners, and he's kind of picked up the pace over the last 3 games, throwing 3 touchdowns in each of those games. He's yet to see a 300-yard passing game. I think we can forgive him for that as the Seahawks have established themselves as a running team. But honestly, I kind of like Russell this week. Unless you have someone significantly better and has a better matchup, I think Russell Wilson will find the end zone either on the ground or a couple times through the air. Again, this is a 48-point over-under. Touchdowns are going to need to be scored. So, again, if you have someone better with a better matchup, go with them. If not, go with Wilson. Now we head out to Denver, Mile High. The Broncos take it on the visiting Texans. Broncos, 2.5-point home favorites, 47.5-point over-under. Backfield for the Texans tends to have, Lamar Miller in it a little bit more, playing in 16% more plays than Alfred Blue. And the goal line goes to Miller, way more than Alfred Blue. He gets the goal line carries. His number gets called when they're in the red zone. Lamar has been averaging 18 carries over the last 3 weeks, and he's coming off back-to-back 100-yard rushing games and a touchdown in each. He's going up against a Denver Bronco defense that has already fell victim to two 200-yard rushers this season, and no signs of improvement anytime soon. I love Lamar Miller this week out at Mile High Stadium and would play him as a confident running back 2 this week if the game script goes according to plan, which I think it will. Vegas having the Broncos as only 1-point favorites at home right now. Look for Miller to get a lot of carries and keep the Broncos off the field in a tight game. Stay away from Alfred Blue. For the receivers, it's really just DeAndre Hopkins right now. I think with the season-ending injury to Will Fuller and Kiki Coutie's status for Sunday still up in the air, I think it's safe to say Hopkins is in line for another monster performance. Top-tier wide receiver of the highest caliber moving forward for the rest of the year. As far as Deshaun Watson goes, I don't think we'll see another 5-touchdown game from Watson like we did last week. But with this receiving core banged up, I think the most we can expect from Watson is a couple of big plays and maybe a touchdown to DeAndre Hopkins, but that's about it. It's a tough place to play, banged up at the receiving spot. I think he sit Deshaun Watson this week until the Texans have more targets on the outside. Now we talk about the Broncos. And, this is a tough, in terms of their running backs, this is a tough Texans defense that has only given up 3 rushing touchdowns, managed by the defensive genius Romeo Crennel. It doesn't really come to much of a surprise that the Texans are giving up under 100 yards on the ground a game and limiting opposing backs to only 3.5 yards per carry. Although Phillip Lindsay has definitely established himself in prior weeks as the primary running back, getting the ball a lot more than Royce Freeman, I think he gets downgraded this week to a flex play. He'll get the goal line carries and a decent amount of touches, but I expect the Texans to bottle him up pretty well and contain him. The receivers for the Broncos, when we think of the top 5 fantasy wideouts, Emmanuel Sanders doesn't really come to mind at first. But, he's had a dominant fantasy season so far, averaging 18.7 points per contest, and without question, Case Keenum's favorite target. Emmanuel remains a high-end wide receiver 2 for the rest of the year, and depending on your team's roster, a wide receiver 1 based off the numbers. Unfortunately, we got to mention Demaryius Thomas, his counterpart, who, man, he's disappointed a majority, if not all, fantasy owners. With only one 100-yard game on the season that he barely got, and only one 20-plus point fantasy outing, I really think it's time that owners forget the receiver who once was and start looking for a better option. Try to package something together to get rid of him off your team. I'm going to downgrade Thomas to a wide receiver 3 at best. And again, I'm going to urge owners to look in a different direction moving forward. Game of the week, got the visiting undefeated Rams. Tight spread this week too, taking on New Orleans. In New Orleans, 1.5-point underdogs for the visiting undefeated Rams. 60-point over-under in this one. Barn burner in the making. Now, okay, Todd Gurley, running back for the Rams. Okay, when a running back has scored in every game and has scored 3 touchdowns in 3 separate games, there's no question he's the best fantasy player so far this year. And, I don't need to sit here. I'm not going to sit here and break down Gurley's dominance and analyze it. I know everyone is well aware of what he's doing this year. But I do want to say one thing on the matter, and that's to all Gurley owners, and that is not to trade Gurley under any circumstances. Think of 2006 LaDainian Tomlinson. 31 touchdowns for scrimmage, 2,300 scrimmage yards. Would you trade LT away for any assortment of players back then? No, absolutely not. And Gurley is on a very similar pace to that of LT in 06. He's fantasy gold of the highest value and does not need to be, shipped off to get, a few good receivers and a back that could maybe fill the void a little bit. Stick with Gurley for the rest of the year. Don't even think about trading him. Now we talk about this trio of wide receivers for the Rams, okay? Brandon Cooks, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp. Solid wideouts. All 3 of them are very solid plays every week. And, but the injury to Cooper Kupp still leaves his status for Sunday's game up in the air. So Kupp owners who are relying on him, monitor that closely as the week progresses. Robert Woods, without question, I think is the best receiver out of this group. And it's shown in the games, And with a game coming up with a 60-point over-under, tight spread, a lot of points to be scored. There's going to be a back-and-forth game, high scoring. I expect a big afternoon for Woods, a solid high-end wide receiver 2 play this week. And then you have opposite him Brandon Cooks, who started off hot. He slowed up a little, but I like him this week against the Saints as more of a low-end wide receiver 2 this week, right behind Robert Woods. Jared Goff, okay? Again, I'm going to keep mentioning this over-under. This should be kind of a signal to a lot of people to start quarterbacks in certain games where there's going to be a lot of air yards. This is set up to be a shootout, and I expect Goff and Breeze to go at it. Green light all the way for Goff as a starter this week. Sean Payton's crew, Drew Brees coming off that terrible week. We'll talk about that in a second. We'll start with the New Orleans running backs, okay? And this really frustrates me. I don't want to make any wild predictions and come out and say it, but I'm gonna. I don't care. I think Mark Ingram is going to be underused a lot on Sunday. I think it needs to happen. I truly believe Alvin Kamara has potential to be one of the best all-purpose running backs in the entire league. And Ingram should only really be coming in for certain packages, in my opinion. I mean, not to take away or discredit him as a running back. I think he's a good running back. But when, you share a backfield with Alvin Kamara, I think Ingram really needs to be only coming in for short yardage stuff like 3rd and 1, goal line carries, certain screen stuff. I still think you can start Mark Ingram on Sunday, but as a running back 3 flex play, and Kamara for me is still a solid running back 1 option. I mean, the guy is just too damn good. On the ground or through the air, he can do it both and equally well. Game script favors Kamara a lot more than Ingram in this one. This is going to be a passing game. There's going to be a lot. Listen, 8 catches, 9 catches. Wouldn't be surprised to see it from Kamara this week. Maybe a touchdown or 2. I can see a 30-point outing for Alvin Kamara. Expect a huge day for number 41. Now for the Saints receivers, I think Michael Thomas is the only one that deserves an honorable mention. Top 10 fantasy receiver this year so far, courtesy of that hot start he got off to. He's kind of cooled off a little bit, but he's still a threat. Drew Brees has to throw it to someone. He's their big weapon in the passing game. And for me, he's still a solid, low-end wide receiver 1 this week, especially in this matchup, with a shootout against the Rams. And Drew Brees, last week, 125 yards, 1 touchdown, didn't even scrape double-digit fantasy points. Quarterbacks always have their off weeks fantasy-wise, and Brees had one last week. He's a future Hall of Famer, The game script we saw didn't favor Brees airing the ball downfield last week against Minnesota. I think we can write it off as Drew Brees owners that was just, an off week, and he's going to bounce back this week for a big performance at home against the visiting Rams. Now we got Green Bay, another big underdog game for Aaron Rodgers and the gang. 6.5-point dogs for the Packers as they travel up to Foxborough with a 56.5-point over-under. Another shootout projection in that one. Start with Green Bay and the running backs. I'm not really sold on either back or all 3 backs, Ty Montgomery, Aaron Jones, Jamal Williams. They really haven't done anything noticeable all year. Aaron Jones would be the only one I would say that you could consider under dire circumstances to be a starting flex option. But again, that's only in a desperate situation. The Packers love to air the ball out, and I expect that to be the case on Sunday. For the receivers, Devontae Adams is really the only person anyone should be considered starting out of this receiving core. He ranks 4th overall in fantasy this year among fantasy wideouts. And without question, Aaron Rodgers' favorite target. Adams has been rolling red hot the past 3 weeks, going over 130 yards receiving in each of those 3 games and 3 total touchdowns over that stretch. He remains a high priority wide receiver run moving forward, especially with a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball for the rest of the year. Jimmy Graham, coming back to New Orleans where it all started, tight end position. Again, it's so tricky to gauge this year. He's coming off a 1-catch game last week, 3.1 points against the Rams. but he's put up double-digit points in the 3 games before that. But the tight end situation looking like it's been all year, and like I've talked about this before, if you're really faced with no better options, you got to start Jimmy Graham this week. And as far as A-Rod is concerned, Aaron Rodgers is staged for a huge game. Just a 1-touchdown game for Aaron Rodgers last week against the Rams. But this is a projected shootout on the road. Packers are going to have to throw the ball deep and expect to score a lot of points to keep up the pace. I expect them to pile up a ton of passing yards and definitely a few touchdowns to go with it. Easy start at the quarterback position this week for Aaron Rodgers. Let's talk about Hoodie and the Pats, Bill Belichick's crew. Josh McDaniels calling the plays. Safe to say you can rule out Sony Michel out of the backfield for the Patriots this week. So that leaves us with James White. Brady's favorite target. Leads the Pats in twice as many receptions as anyone else on the team. Most receiving yards than anyone else on the team. And 8 total touchdowns, which is 6 more than anyone else on the team. I'm going to come right out and say it, and that's the fact that James White, right now, according to the numbers, is a stable, high-end running back 1 candidate moving forward. I mean, the numbers are there. This is fantasy football. You can shake your head and say, oh, man, this guy, went drafted either late round or undrafted. He was picked up of waivers. How is this guy, it's not really a name that sticks out. I think a lot of fantasy owners are under this misconception with this whole big name factor. And sometimes you got to just put that aside and say, listen, this guy's getting it done. This guy is doing it. He ranks 5th best at the running back position in fantasy, and he's averaging 21 fantasy points per contest. And this is a guy who's been claimed off waivers in a majority of leagues. I love James White for the rest of the year. If you got him in a steal of a trade earlier in the year, you picked him off waivers, congratulations. You just got yourself the steal of the year. In terms of receivers for the Patriots, it's a very tricky situation to look at because of how equally Brady distributes the ball. He's got a very talented receiving core with Josh Gordon, Julian Edelman, Rob Gronkowski, obviously he's a tight end, but we'll throw him in there just for argument's sake. And Chris Hogan. Okay, so we have these 4 guys. I wouldn't put Julian Edelman or Josh Gordon higher than a wide receiver 3 play. Not because I don't think they're talented. It's just really too hard to predict who's going to come away with the most touchdowns or the biggest plays downfield on any given Sunday. Last night we saw Edelman go for 9 catches for like 110 yards, while Gordon, he was targeted a few times downfield, only came away with 4 catches. So again, that could be flipped this week. There's no question that either of these guys, I think they'll have decent fantasy outings. It really just depends who you think will have the better day that you want to start. And in terms of Big Gronk, for what fantasy owners expected of him thus far, it's been very disappointing. Only 1 touchdown that came way back when, if you can remember it, in week 1. And in the last 7 weeks, listen to this, he's only been targeted twice in the red zone. That's got to be alarming to Gronk owners. And quite frankly, it should scare the living hell out of you guys. Considering the talent that he still is a must-play every week because of the big play potential and what he brings to the table. I just hope that he has a big outing just for fantasy owners' sake, but just don't be let down if he lets you guys down again. Tom Brady, no touchdowns through the air for Brady last night in Orchard Park. Only 13 fantasy points, which came as a big disappointment, considering he threw for over 300 yards. Number 12 is number 12, though. And, with the game script projected ahead, I can confidently see another 300-yard passing day and a couple of touchdowns to go along with it this week at home against the visiting Packers. Solid start for Brady for me this week. And we got the last game of the day, Monday night. This is, in my opinion, nothing really to see here. This is Tennessee at Dallas. 6.5-point home favorites for Dallas and a very low 41-point over-under, which tells us there's not going to be a lot of fantasy star power outside of Zeke Elliott in this game. I'm going to just make another full disclaimer like I did with the Jets and talk about Tennessee. The Tennessee Titans team has just, on offense, been far from disappointing this year. They've just been absolutely terrible. Nobody, I repeat, no one on their team has anywhere close to 100 fantasy points through 8 weeks. Granted, they just had a bye week. Even if they played 2 more games, I don't see anyone on that team coming close to 100 fantasy points. And Marcus Mariota, for the talent that he is, he ranks third worst among starting quarterbacks in fantasy scoring this year with only 9 points per outing. And neither Deion Lewis or Derrick Henry has rushed for anything close for over 100 yards. I think Deion Lewis did it once. Derrick Henry, I don't think more than 60. This is a low over-under. I don't see any breakout performances on the horizon for anybody on the Titans. The safest play here is to just start dropping Tennessee Titans players from your roster. There are too many better players out there that you can find on waivers or package a trade together to get something decent. But unless anything drastic changes for this Titans team moving forward, stay away from all Tennessee Titans players in fantasy football. Now we'll talk about Dallas. Again, not really much to see here. We'll start at the running back position. The Buckeye workhorse for the boys, Zeke Elliott, averaging 19 carries a game and 88 yards, which both rank second behind only Todd Gurley. But this is interesting because, fantasy-wise, it's been somewhat disappointing to say the least. He's only scored more than 20 fantasy points in one outing this year, but he still ranks 10th among fantasy running backs. I think his status for me is going to start to get knocked down to a low-end running back 1, running back 2, considering that there is a lot of tough games ahead for him against top 5 run defenses. As far as the wide receivers go, there's really no update yet on whether Amari Cooper will make his debut in the silver jersey this weekend. But even still, if he does, I would probably lean in the direction of not playing any Dallas wide receivers this week. The Cowboys have only one receiver all year with only one 100-yard receiving game this year, and that was Cole Beasley, who managed just to grab 101 receiving yards a few weeks back. Not a fan, like many, of Dak Prescott's throwing ability or any of the talent downfield from the Cowboys. I think in this game as a whole, the only player that you can really start is Zeke Elliott. And that wraps it up, guys. That's all the games that are on the plate next week. It's going to be an action-packed week. It's week 9. Bengals on bye week, Colts on bye week. A lot of injuries going around. So I really hope this episode helped out a lot of fantasy owners or just listeners in general who just wanted to get more insight on individual teams' talent and their positional players and, moving forward into week 9 matchups. So with that being said, again, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and I look forward to seeing you guys for episode 4.